Okay. So, welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first ever, hopefully our first annual Canadian educational meeting. We're in just outside Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and we are fortunate enough to be hosted here at the headquarters, the national headquarters of the Royal Canadian Legion. I'll invite Brad White up in a moment to say a few words. Let me get that. I guess not, false alarm. So thank you all for coming. I know many of you have come from far away. Dave came from northern Saskatchewan. Marge and Dave came from northern Saskatchewan. I think that might be the furthest. Anyone? Oh, and Roxy. Yeah.
Calgary.
Calgary. Okay. I think that he has you beat. Anyone
No,
from?
we're north.
Yeah,
You said north. We're gotta be.
Is it further as the crow flies?
Oh yeah.
To northern. Okay. So anyone from BC? No. Okay. Not this year. Maybe next year we'll get someone from BC. So welcome everyone, and welcome to everyone around the world watching our live stream. I'm Remington Nevin. I'm Executive Director of the Quinism Foundation. Quinism Foundation is a brand new nonprofit established just this year, January 1st, 2018, in beautiful White River Junction, Vermont. That's where I live. That's the home of our organization. It was where we held our first ever organizational annual meeting this past April. And for those of you that are close by that think you might be able to make it to Vermont next year, I'd encourage you to book the last Monday of April off. Monday and Tuesday of that week, we'll be hosting our next annual meeting. And I hope this becomes a regular thing. I hope that in September, I come up here to give our Canadian meeting, and then every April, many of you can join us in Vermont for our annual meeting. I had many folks say they couldn't make it to Vermont for whatever reason, and could we please plan on doing something in other parts of the continent? I had many requests from California. I know many of our constituents are in California. We're working on that. I can't promise anything, but hopefully within a year we can do something in California. But I had many requests to do something in Canada. So this is honoring that commitment. And of course, our timing of this meeting is unabashedly intended to coincide with the rally, the Mefloquine awareness event, which is going to be held on the front steps of, I guess, the center block of Parliament Hill, right, tomorrow at 1 p.m.?
Yes.
Tomorrow, 1 p.m., center block of Parliament Hill. Marge and other Canadian veterans are holding a Mefloquine awareness event. Many of you are here specifically for that, and we thought this would be perfect timing, because the focus of this meeting, and I think the focus of future meetings, at least for the foreseeable future, will be on the needs of Canadian veterans who are suffering from Mefloquine poisoning. This is very much part of our organization's strategy to focus on the needs of veterans affected by this condition. This condition, Mefloquine poisoning, what we call chronic quinoline encephalopathy or neuropsychiatric quinism, affects many groups of people. It affects civilian travelers here in North America who travel overseas. It affects government workers who are given this drug as part of their duties. It affects people in countries in the developing world who are given this drug to treat malaria. It also affects veterans. But of those groups, of all those groups that I named, the group where we can harness the most public concern and support for attention to this issue, we think is among veterans. That's why our group was founded by veterans. 5 of us on the board of directors in the States, all of us are military veterans. We know how much this issue has impacted veterans. So even though there are many groups around the world affected by this, I hope they understand that there's a reason we're focusing on veterans at this point in time, because we feel we can make the most progress raising awareness of this issue when we focus on problems affecting veterans. So that's a little introduction. Before we get started, we have a very informal agenda today. I'm an academic. I teach college courses, so I need to give a slide presentation. That's just what I do. If I don't give a slide presentation every few months, I get antsy. So I'm going to be giving you my usual slide talk. And then we'll take a break. And then we'll probably have an informal discussion about some of the other things that I mentioned in the meeting announcement. And I'm actually happy to take cues from the audience as to what you want to focus on. But this initial talk, I'm just going to give you the standard dump of science. So all the science that goes into our publications and our position on this issue, I'm going to give you that to get you up to speed on what we know about this issue. And this is focused a little bit on the U.S. aspect of things, but that's because we've made a lot of our progress on the U.S. side of things. And we'll talk more about the Canadian-specific issues, I think, in future sessions. So that's just a warning of where we're going to go. This first session is probably going to be a little over an hour, and then we'll take a break. We'll have plenty of time to chat. And I would be happy being done at 4. If you'd like to stay a little longer, if you want more, we could extend it to maybe 4:30 or even 5, but I think less is more, so I'm happy to get out of here earlier. And that way you can be all well rested for tomorrow. So if I could, Brad, can I have you come up and let me just introduce Brad White, our host for this meeting. We are very fortunate to have the support of Royal Canadian Legion in giving us this space to have our meeting. A big round of applause. Royal Canadian Legion.
Let me welcome you all to Legion House, as we call it. This is the national headquarters of the Royal Canadian Legion. I am the National Executive Director for the organization. I've been here since about, well, I'm going to say 2009 in this current position, but I've been in the Legion for about 20 years. When I left the military in 1998, I guess it was, after 23 years of service with the military. I'm a tanker by trade, so you have to excuse some of my mannerisms, sometimes a little fast, sometimes a little abrupt, but always threatening with firepower anytime I get a chance. This is important to us. I took Mefloquine when I went to Haiti, so I know some of the issues that are going on here that we're going to discuss. So I know some of the stuff about what we're going to discuss here today. And I'm happy to support not only Remington, but Dave and the crew. I think you're doing good work, and we need to continue the work. The Legion has asked the government to conduct research. So far, that has led us nowhere. So we will continue to ask the government for research into this issue because we think it is an issue that needs to be addressed. Not only me, but I have a lot of friends who've been taking Mefloquine and are suffering the consequences thereof. So I know it's real. It's not anecdotal. I see it every day. Okay, so we need to do this. We have a service bureau across the country that supports veterans all across the country, starting at our branch level right through to our national level. And my service officers are seeing this across the country all the time. So there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be done. We need to get it moving, and the Legion will continue to support this effort. I'm not sure if you want to do it now or do it later, but I think it might be useful if we identify who we are in the room. You may not want to have it on the camera or not. You might want to turn that off. But with me today is Najma Bond. Najma is my communications officer, and she's new on the scene. She's not military, but she keeps us military people in line like all good public affairs people are supposed to do. And Tom McGregor's in the back. Tom is actually from Legion Magazine, and I don't know of how many of you saw the article that was written by Sharon Adams in Legion Magazine, which is a very good expose on the issues of Larium Mefloquine. So we are seized of the issue. We had a discussion this morning. We will continue to be seized of the issue, and we'll be more engaged in the very near future, I hope.
Yeah.
So welcome to Legion House.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and as Brad said, we will have time. We're going to have a more informal session where we go around and introduce ourselves. But for the sake of the folks watching at home, and for the sake of anonymity, for those that want to preserve that, we'll keep the camera focused here, and we'll save the introductions until the next session. So yeah, this is the extent of the promotional material I put together for this. Sorry guys, you know this has to happen. PowerPoint mistake. Okay, and I apologize. I'll try not to make this death by PowerPoint, but I want everyone to have a common frame of reference when we talk about this drug. So we are the quinism Foundation, we are interested in poisoning by drugs of the quinoline class, but for this talk we're going to mostly talk about mefloquine. And you can tell drugs of the quinoline class because they all end in quin. This is the drug we're talking about, mefloquine or Lariam. It was first licensed in some jurisdiction in the world, I believe in 1985, by Roche Pharmaceuticals, developed by the US military over the preceding 20 years. It became available in the United States in 1989. And although it was used in Canada during the period, it was only licensed in Canada in 1993. We'll be talking more about that later. You can tell it's mefloquine because, unlike many other drugs, all formulations of mefloquine, meaning brand name, generic, whatever country you're in, all formulations of mefloquine, to my knowledge, have been white, round, smaller than dime-sized tablets. They're not capsules, they're not blue, they're not pink, they're white, round, smaller than dime-sized. And typically, they've been packaged in these blister packs, these foil blister packs. Early on in the marketing of the drug, they were put in individual foil pouches because they thought it wasn't as stable as it ended up being proven to be. So most people will get it in these sleeves, these little sleeves with individual blister packs. Some people just got it in bottles. Some people got it in little baggies. So here's where we are with the drug today. Licensed in Canada in 1993 with very few warnings, and the product insert today, the Canadian mefloquine product monograph, says very clearly that mefloquine for prevention of malaria, meaning taking a 1 tablet a week, can cause serious mental problems. Symptoms of serious mental problems may include severe anxiety, depression, unreasonable feelings that people are trying to harm you, persecutory delusions or paranoia, seeing or hearing things that are not there, visual and auditory hallucinations, thoughts of suicide or harming yourself, suicidal ideation, feeling restless, confused, disoriented, unusual behavior, unusual changes in your mood, and panic attacks. Add to that crippling insomnia and nightmares, which are conceded elsewhere in the product label. And then serious nervous system problems, including dizziness, a feeling that you or things around you are moving or spinning. The name for that is vertigo, a sense of motion. Loss of balance, disequilibrium, ringing in your ears, tinnitus or tinnitus, and seizures. And here's the key language. These serious mental and nervous system side effects may occur at any time, and in a small number of people may last for months or years after stopping mefloquine. And in the old days, they used to say these may last for days or weeks. So saying months or years now means clearly more than a few years. This is synonymous with decades. And based on pharmacovigilance data, the Canadian government knows these symptoms have been reported for decades. And this final line, which is critical, in some people, dizziness, vertigo, tinnitus, and loss of balance may become permanent. So what do you call a condition that is permanent and which causes some interference in the quality of your life? That's a serious adverse reaction. It's a serious disabling adverse reaction. So the government of Canada, Health Canada, by approving this, by actually demanding this language, they demanded this language, Health Canada and the government of Canada are conceding that in some people, mefloquine, when used for the prevention of malaria, as it has been in the Canadian Forces, causes permanent disability. They've conceded this already. They may not be 100% convinced that the evidence supports this, but they're 99.99% convinced of this, convinced enough to mandate it in these warnings. So how did we get here? Let me just go back a few years and review this remarkable decade that we've had. I've been working in this field for about a decade. It's been remarkable to see the shift. To have this drug that was developed by the US military, first-line drug, for whatever reason, be shoved to the back of the medicine cabinet. It's remarkable how the US military's opinion has changed on this. And it really started in 2012. It really started in 2012 when I saw the tide shifting. In 2012, some former colleagues of mine, some military preventive medicine docs, published this chapter in the CDC's Travel Medicine Handbook. This is the handbook that travel medicine docs use to decide what medicines to give folks that are traveling. And they had a special section for military personnel. And these military physicians conceded that the military is no longer using mefloquine as much as it used to because the neuropsychiatric side effects of mefloquine may confound, meaning confuse or complicate, the diagnosis and management of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, which makes the continued routine use of mefloquine less desirable. And this is a gross understatement, isn't it? And this is about as much of a mea culpa as you could expect from the U.S. military. That preceded by about a year and a half the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issuing the first boxed warning, or black box, for mefloquine. And what boxed warnings are is not always new information. Information that's in a black box is not always new information. Information is put in a black box when it's important enough that it can't be missed, and occasionally when drug regulators realize that that important information, when previously buried in the product insert, has been ignored. So they elevate it to a boxed warning to direct extra attention to it. And in the case of the FDA box warning, there were elements of both. There was a new concession, namely that mefloquine could cause, well, it's really not that. It's really not that much of a concession because what the FDA said was that mefloquine may cause adverse reactions that can persist after mefloquine has been discontinued. And we've known that all along, haven't we? But initially they said days to weeks because of the half-life, and now they say years or permanent. It's this last line that was key, that they elevated into the box warning, and I think is the most critical language. They said during prophylactic use, meaning prevention, if psychiatric or neurologic symptoms occur, the drug should be discontinued and an alternative medication should be substituted. This warning has been in the US label since 2002, but it was universally ignored. What this language is telling you is that if you experience any psychiatric or neurologic symptoms during use of mefloquine, to include abnormal dreams, nightmares, insomnia, changes in mood, any change in mental state, you must immediately stop taking the drug. And why is that? Because the occurrence of psychiatric symptoms suggest a risk for more serious psychiatric disturbances or neurologic adverse reactions. In these cases, the drug should be discontinued. And what did we say is a more serious reaction? A permanent disabling adverse reaction from the drug. This is all we need to know about mefloquine, and we've really known this all along. It's just been ignored. It's been buried deep in the product insert. So now they're saying, take it seriously, pay attention to it. But this was back in 2013, and the message still didn't get accepted by the travel medicine community and by various militaries around the world. So the product insert makes very clear all of these adverse effects that the Canadian product insert warns about today. It's all in there. It's been in there pretty much since 1989. Loss of balance may continue for months after discontinuation of the drug and may be permanent in some cases. This was a new concession, that some of these adverse effects could be permanent. And in the context of the boxed warning, the U.S. military basically doubled down on a position that it had taken earlier in 2013, which was to quietly deprioritize use of mefloquine. It used to be first choice drug on operations all around the world. But in April 2013, and again with this August memo, they just came out and said it. Mefloquine is the drug of last resort for prevention of malaria and should only be used for people that can't take any other drug. Now, there are problems with that policy. Namely, if you're using mefloquine as a drug of last resort and the product label tells you if you develop insomnia, stop taking mefloquine and use another drug, well, what other drug is there to take? There is no other drug to take. And what if you're in a malarious area and you develop insomnia from mefloquine, which you're using as a drug of last resort? What are you supposed to do then? You can't do anything. You have to be evacuated and come home. So I argue that it's irresponsible to use mefloquine as a drug of last resort, but I'm happy with militaries adopting this policy in favor of continuing to use it as a first-line drug because it's better than nothing. But really, a military shouldn't be using mefloquine as a drug of last resort because it's inherently irresponsible to the people that you're giving it to. And really what this is, what that policy is it's a way for governments to all but eliminate use of mefloquine without conceding there are problems with the drug, and without being responsible for admitting why. It's a face-saving measure. It's a measure that allows governments to save face, to kick the can down the road, minimize current harm, minimize future harm, while avoiding having to be responsible for past policies. And here you see in the military, it was around the time that Obama came to office that we started to see a decline in the use of mefloquine. I think it has a lot to do with some of the people he appointed to, let me get rid of this here, okay. It had to do with a lot of people he appointed to senior positions in the military. They were willing to concede certain things and break with tradition. So by 2013, mefloquine comprised roughly 1% of new anti-malarial prescriptions in the US military. So a remarkable change in policy. Now, in the last few years, there's been a handful of critical publications that have come out that have expanded on what we know about mefloquine, and one of them is this study from the Scandinavian countries. What they did was they looked at folks who had reported acute adverse effects with mefloquine, meaning they'd reported nightmares or they'd reported anxiety with use of mefloquine. And because everything is tracked in Scandinavia, a few years later they tracked these people down. And they said, how are you doing now? It's been 5 years, how are you doing? And remarkably, of the folks that had reported nightmares with use of the drug, well over 1 in 5 were still reporting experiencing nightmares at that time, over 3 years after use of the drug. And those who reported cognitive dysfunction, fully a third of those that had initially reported cognitive dysfunction were still experiencing it over 3 years after. So this is very good evidence. This is very good evidence because these are folks that had filed drug adverse event reports, and they were contacted and asked how they're doing today. And there's very little else that we can plausibly attribute these symptoms to. And in someone that reported an adverse reaction from a drug, you would suspect drug reaction. So there's good evidence that nightmares, which we know affect roughly 1 in 7, abnormal dreams and nightmares affect 1 in 7-ish people who take the drug for prophylaxis. 1 in 5 of those will continue to experience nightmares over 3 years after use. So well over 1% of folks that take mefloquine for prevention of malaria can be expected to have these chronic symptoms. And that's only nightmares. We're not talking about the other symptoms. We don't have a lot of good data for the other symptoms, but there's no reason to think that it would be any different. And then we got this remarkable paper. Colleagues of mine in the US military published a case report of a soldier. I'd actually been involved in his evaluation and referred him to some care in the military, and he was fortunate to have been picked up by this group. They recognized that this fellow had a lot of symptoms that looked like post-traumatic stress disorder. He had a lot of symptoms that looked like traumatic brain injury, dizziness and so on. But they confidently attributed all of these things to mefloquine. And they pointed out that this looks a lot like PTSD. And this is very problematic, particularly in a military setting. And this again is one of those understatements, right? Especially pertinent, it demonstrates the difficulty in distinguishing mefloquine-induced toxicity versus PTSD and raises some questions regarding possible linkages between the two diagnoses. I published this not very long ago. This was a fellow who took mefloquine as part of a military study in 92, I believe, 1991, 1992, in Hawaii. They gave mefloquine to a bunch of troops in Hawaii. They wanted to see how troops tolerated it. And this fellow did not tolerate it at all. He was having terrible symptoms, but he didn't say anything. He didn't admit to any of his symptoms, as many soldiers are loath to do, right? He was experiencing some fairly crippling symptoms, but he just kept his mouth shut. And so the study came away thinking the drug was a lot safer than it was. But those symptoms never went away. He continued to suffer from the anxiety and the sleep problems. And independent of any interaction with me initially, he presented to his doctors, and his doctors were convinced. He didn't have any plausible traumatic exposures overseas. He didn't have a strong deployment history. His symptoms very clearly began around the time of his use of the drug, and we know that the drug causes these symptoms. So his doctor felt comfortable opining that his disability was due to mefloquine, and so he submitted a claim to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and they awarded him a disability award due to his service-connected use of mefloquine. So he's one of the first purely psychiatric cases of disability linked to mefloquine. And we have a dozen-ish of these cases that we know about, and clearly that's the tip of the iceberg, because if we've been able to find this many so far, there are many, many more out there. Now, predictably, the U.S. military and now the VA are responding with studies of their own, doing what large organizations do when faced with evidence of a health hazard. They're manufacturing doubt. This is a standard play in my field, in epidemiology. Most of my colleagues in epidemiology, they don't go work for the good guys. They don't go work trying to protect people. They go work for interests that use the skills we learn in public health to advance whatever interests of the organizations. I had a colleague at Hopkins go work for a tobacco company, and her job was basically to make people question whether cigarettes are really as dangerous as they are. It's called manufacturing doubt. It's a standard tactic in industry, and make no mistake about it, the U.S. military and the U.S. VA and arguably the Canadian government are engaging in manufactured doubt, right? In manufacturing doubt. But nonetheless, despite their best efforts to manufacture doubt, evidence emerges from these studies. So here's a paper that actually a former colleague of mine did. And I published a letter critiquing the methods of this. The study has a number of very serious flaws that make interpreting their negative findings challenging. But there were some positive findings in this study that aren't so easy to dismiss. The criticisms I had with the negative findings don't apply to these positive outcomes for various reasons. And what they found is that in the best subgroup, the subgroup where the data is probably of the highest quality, they compared folks that took the safe daily drug Malarone or atovaquone proguanil, and they compared outcomes against those that took mefloquine. When they didn't deploy to combat zones, when they just went on a short vacation or on a short humanitarian mission, and what they found was the folks in the mefloquine group had a nearly doubled incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what's the explanation for that? If they didn't deploy, if they didn't experience any traumas, and if they're otherwise comparable, and why wouldn't they be? What explains the nearly doubled incidence of PTSD in the mefloquine cohort versus the safer daily drug Malarone? Well, the most parsimonious, simple explanation is what my military colleagues had said, that the symptoms of mefloquine poisoning look a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder. They confound the diagnosis. The military concedes. This looks a lot like PTSD. Here we have a doubled rate of PTSD in folks taking mefloquine versus Malarone. It's not that complicated. So I have argued that these things that we call side effects, the vivid dreams, the nightmares, the insomnia, the anxiety, the depression, the paranoia, the persecutory delusions, the cognitive problems, the visual and auditory hallucinations, neurologic symptoms including tinnitus, dizziness, vertigo, disequilibrium, paresthesias, and so on. We'll get to that later. These are not side effects. These are not side effects. These are signs and symptoms of a disease, a toxidrome. And the occurrence of this disease, the development of this disease, mefloquine poisoning, is predicted by the onset of these early subtle symptoms with use of the drug. So if you develop the nightmares or insomnia early during use of the drug, you, for whatever reason, are susceptible to the development of this disease. And that's why they've been telling you all along you have to stop taking mefloquine. And for years we've ignored that guidance, and the roughly 10, 20, 30, 40%, we're still not sure, who experience prodromal symptoms, who continue taking the drug, those are the ones that are at risk of permanent disability as a result. So mefloquine is it's an anti-malarial drug, right? But if you look at what it's doing in most people, and you look at when it's having those effects, it's actually, mefloquine is more of a psychotropic drug than an anti-malarial. This is very counterintuitive, but hear me out. So mefloquine is lipid soluble, meaning it penetrates across lipid membranes, it accumulates in the liver, the lungs, the heart, the brain, we think. And it shouldn't go any of those places. It doesn't need to go any of those places because the malaria parasite's only found in the blood. So when it's going all these other places, that's wasted drug. And in fact, only about 1 to 2% of the drug that you ingest makes its way into the blood where it belongs. Where does the rest go? Goes into all these other organs. You can do a little calculation and roughly double the amount of mefloquine that's in blood is in brain, we think. And this is tricky because it's hard to measure concentrations in people's brains when they're alive. You got to drill a hole in their brain, and most people don't like that. So it's tricky to know for sure. But we think roughly double the amount of mefloquine's in the brain. So the brain's interesting because we have various defense mechanisms. We have various defense mechanisms that protect different parts of our body from potentially toxic substances. The very first defense mechanism our body has is the gag reflex and nausea, right? If someone gives you a poison and it's bitter, your body, if it's well evolved, it will try to throw up that poison. And what does mefloquine cause? It causes nausea, and a lot of people want to vomit their mefloquine tablet. That's sign number one that is probably bad for you, the fact that you're trying to throw it up. There are a number of other defense mechanisms, but presuming that this drug is primarily a neurotoxicant, by the time it's about to get to your brain, the last line of defense is your blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier, we think, offers no defense against the influx of the drug. The drug seems to just freely permeate into the brain. But we think the brain has various defense mechanisms that very quickly pump the mefloquine out. In most people, we think. So most people, we hope, or at least a fair number of people, we hope, as soon as the mefloquine gets in the brain, we hope that it's being immediately pumped out. It's kind of like when you live in New Orleans, below sea level. Even though it may be raining, you got the levees, you got the canal system, you got the pumps. Any rain that comes in is quickly pumped out, and your house stays dry. But for whatever reason, some people maybe don't have a proper defense mechanism. Their last line of defense is broken. The mefloquine gets in their brain, and for whatever reason, it can't be pumped out. That's one theory. It's the neuropharmacokinetic theory of mefloquine toxicity. It's the simplest theory to explain what we see. It's the most elegant. It's the most parsimonious. There's some experimental data backing it up, but we don't know. We don't know. We know very little about what predicts drug toxicity. But this makes sense in the context of prodromal symptoms, because some people experience nightmares and some people don't. And the people that don't experience nightmares, maybe they're the ones that are able to keep the mefloquine out of their brain. And the folks that aren't able to keep mefloquine out of their brain, perhaps the first place the mefloquine acts is on the little nightmare center, and it gives them a bad dream. So that should be your warning that for whatever reason you can't tolerate it. So that's the theory. And this theory, this neuropharmacokinetic theory, this explains why, you know what? Hold on. I'm going to see if I can go back here. Pardon me, viewers at home. We're going to go back a couple slides here. I want to emphasize this more. So the assumption has always been in the military that this drug is safe to use if you don't have a history of depression, if you don't have a history of anxiety. If you're mentally fit, this drug shouldn't be a problem for you. But that's erroneous. That's erroneous. The converse, meaning the drug is dangerous if you have these pre-existing conditions. This is probably true, but for a different reason. And the reason is that if this drug can cause symptoms of anxiety in anyone, and you're someone that's never experienced anxiety before, if you take this drug and you instantly develop symptoms of anxiety, you're going to know something's wrong, typically, if there's nothing else going on in your life. And you're more likely, we hope, to attribute that new anxiety to the drug. And then you'll go to your doctor, hopefully, and say, hey, I'm getting anxious, I think it's the drug, and then you'll get a different drug. That's what we want. That's what the manufacturer wants. That's the whole point of the warnings. If you have a pre-existing history of depression or anxiety, and you take mefloquine, and you experience symptoms of anxiety that are not strange to you, that you've experienced before, then you may be less likely to attribute those symptoms to the drug. You may take your Xanax, you may take another medication, you may say, oh, I'm anxious again. You may miss the fact that your anxiety is a drug side effect or symptom of mefloquine poisoning and continue to take the drug. So that's why we don't give the drug to people with pre-existing mental health problems. It's because it interferes with the recognition of the prodrome. But both people with mental health problems and people without mental health problems, there's no reason to believe that they're not equally susceptible to this drug's toxicity. It's just one group of people will recognize it more. Now, of course, if you're in the military and you're deploying and you have all of these things going on around you, it's very easy to misattribute symptoms of drug poisoning to your circumstances, which is why I would argue it's inherently challenging to use mefloquine in an operational environment. And the data very clearly show this. So this is an open label trial of mefloquine versus the safer drug Malarone. Some people would argue there's a little nocebo effect, meaning people know they're taking mefloquine, so they report more adverse effects. I'll concede a little nocebo effect, but this whole effect is not nocebo. Much of this is actual drug effect. We've known for a long time that soldiers taking mefloquine report nightmares, sleep disturbances, depression, concentration problems at a much higher rate than folks taking the safer drug. And this effect holds true if you blind people to the identity of the drug, meaning you don't tell people what drug they're taking. So whether it's open label and they know, and there's the possibility of nocebo, or whether it's blinded and there's no possibility of nocebo, we know that these symptoms occur very commonly in military settings. Now, all of these symptoms should have required these military subjects to be told to discontinue the drug. But when you read through this paper, they all didn't get that direction. These folks continued to take the drug. This is good evidence. Really, the take-home point from this paper is that militaries ignore the manufacturer's guidance routinely. They just overlook it. They've missed the point. And even as late as 2009, our military in the States just didn't get this. They didn't understand the significance of this. Here's a memo from 2009 saying when you use mefloquine for prophylaxis, psychiatric symptoms can occur at a rate of 1 per 2,000 to 1 per 13,000 persons. Now, this is 3 orders of magnitude different than what high-quality randomized blinded trials had clearly shown. By this point, by 2009, we knew that roughly half, a third to a half, of people taking mefloquine would experience psychiatric symptoms, including insomnia and abnormal dreams and nightmares. So what's the effect of saying these occur at a rate of 1 per 2,000? Well, what it would do is it would stigmatize the reporting of these symptoms, right? Just imagine yourself, the typical soldier, you're doing your best to follow orders and not get in trouble, and you're one of the, let's say, 1 in 7 that experience crippling abnormal dreams or nightmares from this drug, or at the very least disturbing abnormal dreams or nightmares from this drug. And you report this to your doctor, or you report this to your chain of command, and the chain of command looks at this memo and says, hey, Private Snuffy, this memo here says symptoms only occur at a rate of 1 per 13,000 soldiers. So what makes you so special that you think you're the 1 in 13,000? You know, you're the golden child, the one person that experiences these adverse effects. So we know that over the course of our use of this drug, the military has not encouraged soldiers to report these adverse effects. And that creates a vicious cycle, doesn't it? Because soldiers don't report the adverse effects. Military leaders, quite understandably, tell Congress when they're called to testify, we're just not seeing reports of adverse effects. We don't think it's a problem. That leads to memos like this being published that further confound the problem. This is a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle. So, I already talked about this. This is just hammering home the point that it's not true that mefloquine is safe to use in people that don't have a history of mental health problems. That is incorrect. Mefloquine is unsafe to use in people that are experiencing psychiatric symptoms with use of the drug. And it just so happens that people with existing mental health problems have prevalent psychiatric symptoms. So you can't use mefloquine if you're experiencing or have recently experienced psychiatric symptoms. it was 2007. It was 2007 when I deployed to Afghanistan. And in 2007, I wasn't as informed on this issue as I am today. And I was initially of the perspective that I had been taught that mefloquine is safe to use in people that didn't have contraindications. But I was aware, as per the dogma of the time, that you shouldn't be using it in people with mental health problems. And I had seen in our practice using this drug during the deployment to Afghanistan and in Afghanistan that we were routinely giving this drug out to people that had mental health problems. So my initial interest was focused on this. And I was able to access some data, some very good data, looking at roughly 12,000 people in my deployed cohort with me, and I found that roughly 10% of the folks that I had deployed with had some reason not to be on the drug. They had recent prescription for a psychotropic medication, they had some recent diagnosis of a mental health problem. They shouldn't have been given mefloquine. And at the time, I didn't actually count how many of those had been given mefloquine. I would do that later. This was the next paper that I published, and sure enough, I found that of those 1 in 10 that had a contraindication, roughly 1 in 7 had been prescribed mefloquine nonetheless. And I think it was probably those two papers and that analysis. It was replicated by my colleagues independently, and that convinced the Army that it convinced the U.S. Army that, well, maybe the drug wasn't inherently dangerous. They weren't convinced of that yet, but certainly they were having a hard time using it in accordance with the manufacturer's directions. And I think that's what led to the early policy changes, beginning in the U.S. Army in 2009, that built to the military finally declaring it a drug of last resort in 2013. It wasn't a concession that the drug was inherently dangerous. It was a concession that they were just messing up the administrative use of the drug. That's really why the U.S. military policy has changed, and it's probably why Canadian military policy has changed. It's not that the Canadian military concedes the drug is dangerous, they've just conceded it's not worth the hassle to get it right. And that's why we are where we are today. So let me shift gears a little bit and go back to mefloquine poisoning as a disease and describe a little bit why we think it's a disease and what the mechanism is. So mefloquine use in the presence of these prodromal symptoms seems to be what best predicts the development of these chronic symptoms. And chronic neuropsychiatric symptoms that are caused by a drug have a very elegant explanation, and that's neurotoxicity, right? If you take a drug that injures the liver, you may have chronic liver problems, and you may have symptoms and signs that correlate with the injury to your liver. Similarly, if you take a drug that injures the brain and you develop chronic symptoms that are referable to the brain, that's evidence of brain injury, and that's neurotoxicity. And unlike many other structures in the body, the brain typically does not regenerate. The brain is not capable of healing itself. So let me go back here. So when neurotoxicity from a drug occurs, by definition, it's permanent, right? The undo the injury or dysfunction caused by that drug. What's interesting about this postulated mefloquine CNS toxicity is that it should have been predicted all along. We should have known when we were developing this drug that the drug could have potentially had this property. And the reason is that this is something that we identified years and years and years ago. Mefloquine is nothing new. Mefloquine is just the latest in a series of drugs that the U.S. military has been investigating and synthesizing ever since World War II. And it was back in the World War II era that drugs of this class, the quinoline class, were first recognized as being associated with brain and brainstem injury. Specifically, microscopic multifocal lesions throughout very specific areas of the central nervous system. Let me show you some drugs of the class. So this is if I had my poster here, you would see that our organization's logo looks a lot like the thing in the yellow box there, with circles instead of the dashed lines. But that's a quinoline molecule. Two benzenes together, substitute a nitrogen for a carbon, and you get quinoline. And the quinoline core is common to all anti-malarial drugs of the quinoline class. That's why they're called quinolines. And there's a reason why they build anti-malarial drugs off the quinoline core. It's because drugs with the quinoline core seem to be effective antimalarials if they have the appropriate side chains. And if you modify the quinoline core, they're no longer effective antimalarials. So it stands to reason that a portion of the drug that is responsible for its inherent antimalarial activity might also be responsible for some of its inherent toxicity. But if you listen to malariologists, they argue that it's the side chains that mediate toxicity, and that's a bunch of bunk. That's a bunch of bunk. Drugs of a class have similar toxicity. That is basically the drug development community accepts this for every class of drug, it seems, except for quinolines. Now there are slightly different classes of quinoline antimalarials, but basically those differences are less significant than we might think. So this is quinine, the prototypical drug of the quinoline class, the naturally occurring drug that we get from the bark of the cinchona tree. That's mefloquine that was first synthesized, we think, in 1969. There are some other drugs, atabrine or quinacrine. It has 3 rings, but it's really just a ring substituted quinoline. So it's basically a quinoline. Pharmacokinetic, which was used prior to World War II. And I'm just going to talk about some of these drugs real quick, because and then we might take a break, I think. Because I want everyone to recognize that we're not dealing with anything new here. Mefloquine is just the latest drug to have. So in World War II, we were faced with, in the United States, we were faced with an emergency situation because we had no quinine. We had no antimalarial drug. The supplies had been blocked off by the Axis powers in the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So what were we going to do if we were fighting in the South Pacific and we had no antimalarial drug? Well, we resorted to the use of this synthetic drug, atabrine. And atabrine had all sorts of problems that we knew about, but we didn't talk about during World War II because we didn't want soldiers to get freaked out and not take their atabrine. But in the aftermath of World War II, the publications just flowed into the literature, and there were many years, golden years, 1946, 47, 48, where all of this research was published on how atabrine caused toxic psychoses. Basically the very same symptoms we saw with atabrine in World War II. All of these reports were marked secret or restricted. They had to declassify them eventually, but this is not anecdotal. This is not subjective. These were folks that had abnormal electroencephalographs. They had abnormal EEGs. These were doctors that volunteered for these tests, and they went manic and psychotic. They became delirious off fairly physiological, reasonable doses of atabrine. This fellow here experienced an acute panic reaction with considerable flight of ideas and anxiety. Same thing that we see with mefloquine. But use of atabrine was so important during World War II that nothing but positive messages were allowed. We had all these posters saying, take your atabrine, atabrine keeps me going. And sure enough, if atabrine's causing mania, it's definitely keeping you going. These symptoms were far more common than people realize today. And we knew that atabrine was bad. They knew all along it was bad. So early on in the war, they devoted considerable resources to the development and testing of new drugs. And mefloquine ultimately emerged from the fruits of these labors back in World War II. Mefloquine we don't think was discovered in World War II, maybe it was, but the reason mefloquine was developed was because of the foundation that was laid in World War II, the U.S. military drug development program. Here are soldiers being given test doses of these antimalarials. If you were a conscientious objector, there was a good chance you'd find yourself volunteering for antimalarial drug trials. What they found was that drugs of the quinoline class, and there's a couple shown here, had the same effect as atabrine, inducing this toxic, manic, confusional psychosis. So there's very good evidence from this period that drugs of the quinoline class had this effect. And this fellow here, Schmidt, who happened to have been one of the authors of that paper talking about EEG effects with atabrine, he discovered another property of the quinoline. So there's the psychiatric effects, marked most significantly by the development of psychosis. But there's also this weird neurological effect that these drugs had. In a series of papers that he published towards the end of the war, he described how drugs of this class caused neurotoxicity. And they were able to discover this because of all the resources that were devoted to drug testing at the time. Hundreds, maybe thousands of monkeys were administered these drugs, this massive effort to rival the Manhattan Project. Thousands of scientific staff, they tested something like 15,000 compounds, hundreds of quinoline drugs. And what he discovered was that all of the over 140 drugs of this class that he tested in monkeys were uniformly neurotoxic. And they caused these remarkable lesions in doses well below the lethal level. These drugs produce striking symptoms of central nervous system injury associated with severe lesions in the principal nuclei, meaning the control center, of the proprioceptive, position sense, visual reflex, and vestibulocerebellar pathways. And these pathways are, for example, what allows you to run and turn your head and catch a baseball, basically. It's a remarkable series of, it's remarkable the control that's mediated through these nuclei in your brainstem. And without a properly functioning brainstem vestibular system, and without a properly functioning vestibulo-ocular system, all bets are off. The symptomatology is remarkable, and it almost looks aphysiologic. But this is what these drugs do. This is a normal brainstem on the top, and that's a drug-injured brainstem at the bottom. This is plasmicid, the most toxic drug of the class. It's the one drug that actually doesn't end in quin. But the point being is that all drugs of this class, most notably this one, cause these microscopic focal lesions throughout the brainstem. And Schmidt warned us. He warned us back in the 50s. He said that their high inherent toxicity, meaning drugs of this class, and capacity to evoke reactions which might mask symptoms of low-grade neuronal injury, plus the likelihood of their widespread use in malaria therapy, make a detailed search for central nervous system lesions highly desirable. So what he was telling us was that if we were ever to develop new antimalarial drugs, be careful, do a lot of testing, and make sure that the drug is not neurotoxic before you use it in man. While this entire nervous system was probably affected, the brunt of the damage was in definite nuclei of the brainstem from the thalamus downwards, notably from the mesencephalon through the medulla. The symptoms and signs presented by the animals reflected this localization very clearly. So what he's saying here is that, well, the monkeys were dizzy. They were having a hard time balancing. And sure enough, when you dissected their brainstems, the portions of the brain and brainstem responsible for balance sense were destroyed. And adjacent areas of the brain were fine. But those focal nuclei were damaged. And it's remarkable we didn't pay attention to this. There was one case in man. A soldier was given a high dose of Pharmacokinetic, which is one of the drugs of the class we don't use anymore. And sure enough, the same damage occurred to the brainstem of that individual. And it wasn't a super high dose. It was double or triple the normal dose of Pharmacokinetic. So what's interesting is that in this case, the hippocampus was affected. So I've been talking about the brainstem, but this paper and a couple other papers showed that the limbic system of the brain could be affected. So the brainstem controls a lot of basic physiological functions and a lot of the automated things that we take for granted, like being able to stay focused on a distant visual target even when you shake your head. Do it all. You guys do it. Just shake your head and try to stay focused on the person across from you. It's remarkable that you can stay focused. Those of you that have taken Mefloquine, you may not be able to do that because your brainstem's not working right. But all of this stuff is mediated by the brainstem. The limbic system is the part of your central nervous system that mediates emotions and memory, the basic core functions, fight or flight. And that part of your central nervous system is damaged by quinolines as well. So once the hippocampus starts to get affected, again, all bets are off, because damage to the hippocampus can mediate all sorts of emotional and psychiatric and neurocognitive problems. So we should have known at the end of World War II that we had a problem with the quinolines. Atabrine, which was basically the World War II version of Mefloquine, had all these psychiatric effects, and related drugs not only affected the limbic system, but also caused injury throughout the limbic system. And folks in that era warned us that we should be looking for these effects and take them seriously during the development of future drugs. And I think as today's events and the fact that you're all here can attest to, we didn't learn from this, did we? We didn't learn from this. Okay, so I've been talking for a while. There's another third of the slide deck that we will get to at the end of the break. So what time is it now? Does anyone have a time?
2 o'clock.
Perfect, 2 o'clock. So let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back. We're going to talk for 15 minutes. We'll just go around the table and we'll introduce ourselves. And then folks watching at home will broadcast again starting at 2:30. So could I ask you to turn off our live broadcast and we'll see you guys watching.